It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The kind of night where silence wasn't just golden, it was oppressive, heavy, almost tangible, pressing down on you like a damp blanket. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, every rustle, every snap of a twig sounded like a warning. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches creaking in the cold wind, whispering secrets you were never meant to hear. It's the kind of place where your mind starts playing tricks on you. Or maybe it's the place where the tricks are very real. Our first story begins with a group of friends who decided, foolishly, to go camping deep in the forest of northern Maine. They were young, reckless, confident in their ability to handle the unknown. They laughed off the warnings of locals who spoke in hushed tones about the old trails where people went missing. The night they set up their tents, the air was crisp, the sky clear, and the stars bright, almost too bright. It gave the forest a false sense of serenity, masking the lurking terror. By midnight, the group was gathered around a crackling fire, telling ghost stories to one another. The laughter had faded, replaced by the occasional nervous glance into the shadows. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl. Far off, but unmistakable. Their first reaction was to dismiss it as an animal, maybe a coyote or a bear. But the growl wasn't like anything they had heard before. It carried a rhythm, a deliberate pacing, as if it were moving closer. One of them, Mark, thought it would be brave to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and slipped into the darkness, leaving the others behind, who reluctantly followed. The light from the flashlight bounced across the trees, creating grotesque shadows. Every step forward seemed to amplify the silence around them. The growl turned into a series of sharp, echoing snaps, like footsteps on dry leaves. But they were too fast, too precise, too human. Then came the screaming. One of the friends, Jenny, let out a piercing shriek that cut through the night like a knife. The group froze. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Their flashlights swung wildly, illuminating twisted trees. And then, nothing. Jenny was gone. They called her name, panic rising. But the only response was the rustling of the underbrush and a wet, dragging sound that didn't belong to any animal. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt irrelevant out there. The forest seemed alive, shifting and closing in around them. Shadows darted just beyond their vision, teasing them, mocking them. By dawn, only 3 of the original 4 emerged from the woods. Jenny was never found. Locals later told them they had wandered into the territory of the Shadow Walker, a local legend of a humanoid creature that moves silently among the trees, stalking travelers until it finds the perfect moment to strike. The fear didn't end there. The survivors claimed that even in daylight, they could feel it watching them, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next opportunity. Some nights they still hear footsteps outside their windows, perfectly synchronized, perfectly silent. And in the quiet, They swear they can hear the faint, guttural growl that started it all. Our second story takes us to a remote stretch of highway in Wyoming, a place where cell service is a joke, and the nearest town is miles away. A truck driver named Carl was hauling freight late at night when he saw it. A figure standing on the edge of the road, motionless, staring at him. At first, he assumed it was a hitchhiker. But something about the way the figure didn't move, didn't blink, made him uneasy. He slowed down, his headlights revealing only a person dressed in tattered clothing, face obscured. Carl tried to pass, but his truck stalled, completely dead. He fumbled with the ignition, heart hammering, and when he finally got it to roar back to life, the figure had vanished. Shaking, he continued down the road, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the mind. That's when he noticed the tire tracks. Impossible. Jagged tracks that didn't match his truck. They started at the figure, running parallel for miles, sometimes disappearing and reappearing, always at the edge of his vision. By the time Carl reached the next town, he was pale and shaken. Locals listened to his story with a mix of disbelief and quiet dread. They told him about the Phantom Walker, a creature or entity that appears to travelers alone on isolated roads. The phantom doesn't just frighten, it follows, observing, waiting for the moment when its victim is most vulnerable. Carl never drove that highway at night again. And sometimes, when he's alone, he swears he can hear the sound of dragging footsteps in the distance, echoing the terrifying pattern he saw on that deserted stretch of asphalt. Contrast can be strange. It's in these stories that fear is amplified, not just by what we see, but by what we expect to see. Isolation, quiet, and normalcy suddenly distorted into something terrifying. In both the forest and the empty highway, the victims were alone, or nearly alone. That's where horror thrives. In the subtle difference between the familiar and the unknown. Consider the next story, set in a tiny town in West Virginia. A young woman named Laura moved into an old abandoned farmhouse, attracted by the cheap rent and quiet surroundings. The locals whispered about the place, warning her that previous tenants had left abruptly, never explaining why. Laura, a pragmatic person, dismissed the warnings. But her first night in the house changed everything. She awoke to the sound of whispers, soft, almost imperceptible at first, coming from the walls themselves. Attributing it to the wind, she tried to ignore it. But the whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. Doors creaked open and slammed shut. Lights flickered, and shadows darted across rooms with unnatural speed. She installed cameras, hoping to catch something rational, something explainable. What she captured instead were fleeting images of figures standing silently at the edge of the frame, faces distorted, watching her with empty eyes. Eventually, Laura fled, leaving her belongings behind. Neighbors told her she had been lucky. Some say the house feeds on fear, growing stronger with every terrified resident. never satisfied until it has claimed them entirely. Those who stay too long report nightmares that bleed into reality, waking up to find things moved, touched, even spoken to by unseen hands. The contrast between the quiet, peaceful exterior and the horrifying activity inside creates a tension that lingers long after the story ends. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying places are the ones that seem safe at first glance. Even in the most desolate areas, humans often underestimate the danger. In the next story, a couple driving cross-country decided to take a shortcut through an abandoned stretch of road in rural Texas. The GPS had promised a faster route, but nothing prepared them for what awaited. At first, it was just the oppressive silence. No wind, no birds, nothing. Then came the lights. Hundreds of flickering, unearthly lights appeared along the horizon, hovering just above the ground. They didn't move in any natural pattern, pulsing as if the land itself were breathing. Curiosity turned to panic as the car engine sputtered and died. The couple tried to leave, but the lights seemed to respond, moving closer with each attempt. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching for the vehicle as if to drag it into the earth. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time distorted in that haunted stretch. And finally, the lights disappeared. The road returned to normal. The couple reached the next town shaken, unable to explain what they saw. Locals simply warned them never to travel that road at night. Many who did never returned. There's a certain horror in the unknown, a terror magnified when no one else can help. When the laws of nature seem to bend, when isolation makes you vulnerable, each story feeds off that primal fear, that instinctive understanding that something unseen, something otherworldly, could be waiting for you just beyond sight. And in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization, those instincts are sharper, more immediate, and impossible to ignore. The night was colder than expected, and the wind carried a strange metallic scent that seemed to cling to the skin. Our next story takes place in the remote woods of Oregon, where a hiker named Ryan decided to test his limits on a solo trek. He was experienced, confident, used to navigating alone, but nothing could have prepared him for the unease that settled in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest changed at night. What seemed familiar during the day became alien, menacing. The rustle of leaves no longer sounded casual. It became deliberate, almost conversational. Ryan had set up camp near a stream, the soothing sound of flowing water initially calming him. But as darkness fell, he noticed footprints, too large to be his, too precise to be random. They circled his tent, appearing and disappearing in ways that defied logic. At first, he assumed an animal, a bear maybe. But the prints were oddly humanoid. The spacing and stride suggested intelligence, intent. Sleep was impossible. Each snap of a twig outside a calculated reminder that he was being watched. Then came the whispers. Not the wind, not distant animals, but actual whispers, low, guttural, unintelligible, coming from all directions at once. Ryan tried to leave, but his compass spun wildly, useless in the unnatural environment. Every path led him back to the same clearing, the same tent, the same circle of prints. Panic set in. He realized he wasn't lost. He was being hunted. And this forest didn't operate by natural rules. Hours, or perhaps a distorted perception of time. Later, Ryan stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. The door creaked open as if inviting him inside. Against every instinct, he entered. The interior was empty except for old furniture and a journal lying open on a table. The entries described someone or something watching travelers, feeding on fear, learning patterns, anticipating actions. The final entry was a warning. Do not try to escape. It chooses, it waits, and it always finds you. Ryan left immediately, but he never spoke of the experience again. Friends noticed his sleepwalking, his panicked murmurs at night. Sometimes he would wake screaming, staring at an empty corner, as though something was silently observing him. From forests to lakes, the middle of nowhere holds its own breed of terror. In a secluded cabin on the edge of Lake Superior, a family sought a weekend retreat away from city chaos. They thought isolation would bring peace, tranquility. Instead, it brought a creeping dread that seeped into every room. On the first night, the father, Greg, noticed something strange in the water. A small boat bobbing silently with no visible operator. He ignored it, convincing himself it was a reflection or a trick of the moonlight. But the next night, the boat appeared closer, drifting unnaturally against the wind. By the third night, the family's dog refused to leave the cabin, growling at invisible figures along the shoreline. Shadows flickered across the walls, taking forms that resembled distorted humans, leaning toward the windows as though eager to step inside. The family tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. It was as if the lake itself had decided to trap them. Panic escalated, and in a desperate attempt, Greg waded into the water to investigate. He never returned. The remaining family members eventually left, never to come back. Locals whisper that the lake collects those who venture too close at night, leaving only echoes of their presence behind. Contrast becomes more chilling when ordinary activities are turned sinister. Take, for example, a lone driver on a desert highway in Nevada. Michael was making his way to a small town, relying on a GPS signal that occasionally cut out in the barren expanse. Around midnight, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. A woman, drenched in shadow, waving frantically. Michael swerved to avoid her, his tires skidding on loose gravel. When he looked back, the road was empty. He continued cautiously, only to see her again, this time closer, standing on the side, eyes hollow and unblinking. He sped up, but every mile revealed the same phenomenon. She reappeared, appearing and disappearing with impossible speed. Terrified, Michael finally stopped and stepped out, hoping to confront reality. But the figure wasn't there, and the desert remained silent, oppressive, stretching endlessly in every direction. When he returned to town, locals listened to his story, nodding grimly. They spoke of desert shadows, entities that appear in isolated, desolate regions, drawn to fear and disorientation, punishing those who stray too far from civilization. Isolation doesn't need to be natural to become terrifying. In the next story, a group of college students decided to rent a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for a weekend of adventure. They were excited, joking, taking photos and videos to remember the experience. But the fun faded quickly. On the second night, one of them, Sarah, vanished without a trace. The only clue was a series of muddy handprints inside the cabin, leading to the attic. When the others investigated, the attic was empty except for a single chair, positioned in the center, facing a wall. On that wall, words were scratched deeply. "You should have left." Panic ensued. They left immediately, but the fear followed them. Local authorities dismissed their story as a prank. But weeks later, similar incidents were reported in the area. People renting cabins, wandering trails, or exploring abandoned structures all reported sudden disappearances, scratches on walls, whispers at night. The pattern was unmistakable. The middle of nowhere doesn't just isolate you physically. It isolates your sanity, leaving you vulnerable to the horrors that lurk unseen. Even something as ordinary as a walk in the countryside can turn into a nightmare. A man named Tom was jogging along a remote trail in Vermont, enjoying the early morning quiet. Suddenly, he saw footprints in the mud. Not animal, not human, but something elongated, clawed, almost skeletal. Following them out of curiosity, he reached a clearing and saw dozens of similar prints converging on an abandoned barn. Inside, he glimpsed shadows moving against the walls, grotesque shapes twisting and stretching unnaturally. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his chest. He ran, never looking back, and the trail vanished behind him, leaving only silence and a lingering dread. The most terrifying aspect of these stories is not what is seen, but what is suggested. The middle of nowhere amplifies fear through isolation, contrast, and the unknown. Each narrative builds tension by exploiting the human mind's instinctive response to being watched, being alone, and facing the inexplicable. Whether it's whispers in the woods, phantom figures on the road, or shadows in abandoned structures, the horror is never fully tangible. But that's exactly what makes it so relentless. One final tale in this section brings together all the elements: isolation, observation, an inevitability. In a remote section of the Alaskan tundra, a scientist named Elena was studying wildlife. Her cabin was stocked for weeks, miles from the nearest settlement. At first, she relished the solitude. But on the third night, she noticed something disturbing. The wildlife acted unnaturally. Birds refused to sing. Wolves howled in the distance, but never approached. She found her equipment tampered with. Cameras moved or destroyed, and the sense of being watched became overwhelming. Then came the footsteps outside her cabin. Slow, deliberate, never-ending. She tried to document it, to rationalize it, but no recordings captured the source. The sounds remained confined to her ears, her perception, her fear. By the end of her first week, she was convinced she wasn't alone in the tundra. She left abruptly, abandoning her research. Years later, other researchers confirmed strange, unidentifiable tracks in the snow surrounding her cabin, as if something had circled her, learning, waiting, ensuring she would never return. Some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by the feeling that the world itself has gone wrong. In the remote deserts of New Mexico, a man named Javier decided to explore an old ghost town. He had heard stories of vanished miners and unexplained lights in the night. But curiosity outweighed caution. The sun was setting as he reached the outskirts of the town, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of a wind-blown sign. Javier's footsteps echoed against empty buildings, each sound amplified by the eerie stillness. As night fell, he noticed a faint glow emanating from one of the cabins. Inside, the walls were covered in crude drawings depicting figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. A journal lay on a table, the pages filled with frantic scrawls. They come at night, they watched. You are never alone. Javier felt a cold breeze, though all doors and windows were shut. Then, from outside, he heard something. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. He peered out the window, but saw nothing, just the empty, lifeless town. Panic set in, and he ran. But the streets seemed to stretch endlessly, leading him back to the same cabin. By dawn, Javier was found wandering the desert, disoriented, muttering about shadows that followed him wherever he went. Contrast intensifies fear, especially when danger is subtle. In Montana, a couple, Lena and Mark, took a weekend getaway to a remote lodge in the mountains. The first day was peaceful. The lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, and the forest seemed alive with gentle sounds. But that night, the forest turned hostile. Unseen branches scratched at the windows. Leaves rustled in patterns that suggested intention. The couple felt eyes on them constantly. Lena thought she saw figures moving just beyond the tree line, pausing whenever she blinked. Mark dismissed it, insisting it was their imagination. But he, too, could not shake the sensation of being observed. Around midnight, they heard tapping on the roof, rhythmic, precise, impossible for any animal to make. Their attempts to leave were thwarted by a storm that rolled in suddenly, trapping them inside the cabin. The tapping grew louder, now accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. By morning, the storm had cleared, leaving no trace of anyone outside. But Lena and Mark knew they were not alone. The cabin remained empty for years afterward, the lodge owners refusing to rent it out, citing unexplainable occurrences that made it unsafe. Even the simplest journey can turn sinister. In the Alaskan backcountry, a hunter named Greg was tracking moose through miles of untouched wilderness. The snow was deep, the wind biting, and the silence absolute. Yet despite being alone, Greg never felt safe. Shadows moved where no light fell, and he often caught glimpses of figures just at the edge of his vision. One evening, he stumbled across an abandoned hunting cabin. Inside, everything was pristine, as if someone had been living there recently. But the deeper he explored, the more he realized something was wrong. The walls were covered in notes, lists of names, dates, and strange symbols. The last entry was his own name. Fear became unbearable when Greg realized he was being followed. The snow revealed footprints that weren't his, perfectly aligned with his path, as if someone or something was mimicking him. He tried to outrun it, but each time he thought he had gained distance, the tracks were closer than before. Exhausted, he finally made it to a ranger station. When asked about the footprints, the rangers only nodded grimly. Similar incidents had been reported by other hunters in the area, all vanishing without explanation after being stalked in the wilderness. Isolation amplifies terror, but sometimes it's the abandoned structures that hold the greatest horrors. A group of friends in Maine rented an old farmhouse far from town, intending to spend a weekend away from phones and internet. The farmhouse was old, creaking with every gust of wind, but that was expected. On the first night, however, they heard someone or something walking in the attic above. Assuming it was a raccoon or a loose board, they ignored it. But by the second night, the steps became deliberate, pacing, circling, and occasionally stopping directly above the center of the living room. They investigated the attic, finding nothing but dust and old furniture. But the sense of being watched never left. One friend swore they saw a shadow move independently of any light source, slinking along the walls like liquid darkness. Attempts to leave were frustrated by a car that wouldn't start, as if the farmhouse had claimed them temporarily. When they finally left at dawn, they swore never to return. And locals told them the farmhouse had a reputation. Visitors often felt a presence, never able to explain why the house seemed alive, aware, and patient. Sometimes, terror comes not from what's present, but what's missing. In a remote section of Wyoming, a photographer named Ava ventured to capture the sunrise over a mountain range. Alone in the vast landscape, She noticed her surroundings seemed off. Trails she had just walked disappeared, and landmarks shifted unnaturally. Birds didn't sing. Animals were absent. The sky itself seemed to darken, thickening with an unnatural hue. Panic set in when she realized she was lost. But every direction she turned brought her back to the same rock formation. It was as if the world had folded in on itself, isolating her in an endless loop. Ava stumbled upon an old cave, hoping for shelter. Inside, she found carvings on the walls, depicting scenes of people wandering endlessly, their faces frozen in terror. The cave hummed with a low vibration, unsettling and omnipresent. She fled, retracing steps she didn't remember taking, eventually collapsing near a riverbank hours later. The locals confirmed a mysterious phenomenon in the area, known as the Lost Loop, where travelers disappear into the wilderness, returning disoriented or never returning at all. Ava survived, but the memories haunted her forever. The whispering wind reminding her of the vast, unaccountable forces beyond human control. Contrast is key. Ordinary settings become extraordinary nightmares. A lone cyclist in Utah took a trail at dusk, expecting a quiet ride. The desert, which had been warm and familiar hours before, now felt alive, oppressive. Shadows stretched impossibly long. Rocks appeared in different positions than minutes earlier, and the temperature dropped suddenly. He saw figures in the distance, standing perfectly still, only to vanish when approached. Panic overtook him, and he abandoned his bike, running blindly until reaching a highway. He later discovered that hikers in that exact trail reported similar experiences: disorientation, shadowy figures, and an inexplicable compulsion to leave immediately, as though the desert itself rejected human presence. Finally, in the forests of Washington, a camper named Rachel experienced a phenomenon that defied explanation. Alone for a weekend, she noticed her campsite was disturbed each morning. Tents zipped open, belongings moved, but no footprints were visible. The birds and animals acted unusually, silent and watchful. At night, she heard rhythmic tapping on the trees surrounding her and whispers that seemed to echo her own thoughts back at her. Fear escalated into terror when she discovered a series of small, hand-carved figurines arranged in patterns around her tent, depicting figures fleeing, hiding, and eventually disappearing. She packed and left, but her nightmares were filled with these figures, repeating endlessly, reminding her that isolation in the middle of nowhere carries unseen witnesses. Some of the most terrifying moments come when the natural world itself seems to conspire against you. In a remote canyon in Arizona, a hiker named Elias ventured into a slot canyon early one morning, eager to photograph the sun slicing through the narrow rock formations. At first, everything seemed normal. The air crisp, the light beautiful, the silence only interrupted by the occasional call of a distant bird. But as he moved deeper, the canyon walls began to feel suffocatingly close. Shadows stretched in ways that defied logic, and the echoes of his own footsteps seemed delayed, as if the canyon were playing tricks on time itself. Elias heard faint whispers bouncing off the stone walls, barely audible at first, then gradually growing more distinct. He thought he recognized words, pleas for help, but there was no one else in sight. Panicked, he tried to retrace his steps, but the passageways appeared rearranged. Corridors, he swore, had been straight, now twisted and looping. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, and the sun's position in the sky defied reality. When he finally stumbled into an open section of the canyon, he found old, weathered markers etched into the rock, warning travelers to leave while you can. Elias fled, never returning, but later reports surfaced of other hikers lost in that same canyon, disappearing without a trace. Their screams carried away by the canyon's strange acoustics, leaving only echoes behind. Fear doesn't require an immediate threat. It thrives on isolation and uncertainty. In rural Vermont, a man named Henry purchased an abandoned farmhouse at the edge of a dense forest, hoping for peace and solitude. The first night was uneventful, but on the second, he noticed small signs that someone or something had been in the house. Drawers slightly ajar, footprints in the dust, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Thinking it was a prank, he installed cameras, only to find them repeatedly malfunctioned, recording nothing, then erasing all previous footage. One night, Henry woke to the sound of heavy breathing at the foot of his bed. When he turned on the light, the room appeared empty, but the temperature had dropped drastically, and frost formed on the window. The whispers returned, now clearly chanting his name in distorted tones. The next morning, he discovered a series of handprints smeared in condensation across the inside of the windows, though no one could have entered from outside. Locals warned him that the farmhouse had a history. Occupants vanished, only to be found years later in states of severe psychological distress, unable to recount how or why they were tormented. In the middle of nowhere, even the most mundane items can become horrifying. In Oregon, a group of friends went on a camping trip deep in the wilderness. They found an old wooden chest buried partially under leaves. Curiosity drawing them close. Inside were personal belongings, clothes, photographs, and letters dating back decades, but no indication of whose they were. One of the friends, Sam, picked up a photograph of a man staring directly at him, eyes eerily lifelike. That night, the forest seemed alive with movement, shadows flitting just out of sight. By dawn, Sam was missing. His friends searched frantically, discovering a trail of footprints leading to a cliff edge, then abruptly ending. No sign of struggle, No indication of where he went, just the echo of his screams carried by the wind. Weeks later, authorities found the chest again, partially buried in the same location, this time containing items that clearly belonged to Sam, as if the forest had returned what it had claimed. The friends never returned to that site, each haunted by the memory of the man in the photograph and the knowledge that the wilderness could claim what it desired. Contrast heightens terror when nature itself is hostile. In remote northern Minnesota, a couple named Lisa and Tom set out for a weekend cabin stay. The first night was peaceful, the lake reflecting stars perfectly. By the second night, the lake began to behave unnaturally. Waves lapped against the shore, forming patterns that resembled human faces. The forest surrounding the cabin shifted, trees appearing in places they hadn't been before. They could hear whispers over the water, words neither understood nor could forget. Attempts to leave were thwarted by a dense fog that rolled in instantly, disorienting them. The third night, the water began to boil, small whirlpools forming along the shoreline, as if something beneath the surface sought to escape. Lisa awoke to find claw marks along the dock, deep and fresh. By morning, the fog lifted and the lake appeared normal. Yet, the couple's sense of unease lingered. Locals told them the lake was cursed, visited by unknown entities, claiming those who approached it alone or unprepared. The couple left immediately, carrying the memory of the lake that lived and watched. Even abandoned roads can harbor terror. In West Virginia, a driver named Marcus took a back road through the mountains to avoid traffic. The road was narrow, overgrown, and utterly empty. Hours into his drive, the GPS signal vanished, leaving him disoriented. The headlights illuminated figures standing along the roadside, motionless, silent, dressed in tattered clothing. When he slowed down to look, the figures vanished instantly. Panicking, he accelerated, only to find that the road looped back impossibly, bringing him to the same spot repeatedly. As night fell, Marcus realized the radio only emitted static, broken by distorted whispers, some of them sounding like his own voice pleading for help. Exhausted and terrified, he abandoned the car, running blindly into the woods. Dawn found him near a ranger station, trembling, unable to explain how he navigated the forest or why the road appeared to trap him in an endless loop. Locals later explained that the area had been the site of disappearances dating back decades, a section of road where reality itself seemed to bend, swallowing those who ventured too far from the known paths. Isolation can intensify dread in the smallest ways. In New Hampshire, a solo backpacker named Claire set up camp on a remote ridge. The night was quiet, but as she slept, she awoke to the sound of someone or something digging near her tent. She screamed, grabbed a flashlight, and saw nothing but overturned soil and small objects she didn't recognize. The next morning, she discovered small figurines, similar to those in Maine's haunted farmhouse stories, scattered around the tent. They depicted figures hiding, running, and disappearing into thin air. Claire fled immediately, never returning. Yet every forest she passed afterward reminded her of that night, whispering of unseen watchers. Even the most familiar routines can turn sinister when one is alone. In Texas, a man named Paul took a shortcut through a desolate stretch of prairie while driving home. The road seemed infinite, stretching without end, dotted with abandoned buildings and broken fences. As he drove, he noticed a figure walking along the side of the road, always just ahead of him. Whenever he tried to approach, the figure vanished, only to reappear further along. The wind carried whispers. His name, repeated endlessly. By the time he reached the nearest town, Paul felt exhausted, disoriented, and haunted by the sense that he had been followed for hours. Locals told him that the prairie was known for strange phenomena. Travelers experiencing loops, visions, and unseen followers. Paul could never shake the feeling that something had been walking with him, step for step through the endless middle of nowhere. The middle of nowhere doesn't just isolate you. It amplifies the unknown. Those who have wandered too far, stayed too long, or ignored subtle warnings often return changed, carrying a permanent awareness that something unseen moves just beyond perception. Shadows that twist unnaturally, whispers that echo without source, and paths that loop impossibly are not just stories. They were warnings carved into the memory of the land itself. In the end, what terrifies the most is not a monster you can see, but the certainty that you are never truly alone, even when the world is empty. The forests, canyons, prairies, and lakes remember every footstep, every breath, and every fear, waiting silently to interact with those who dare venture into their depths. So, if you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, remember, sometimes it's better to leave curiosity behind, because some things are never meant to be found.